again. In the last class, we were talking about a number of different topics: culture, cultural studies, the history of cultural ideas and ways to think about Latin America. And we were also talking about the history of Central America, which is an important region for a variety of reasons, but also a region that doesn't get as much attention as other parts of Latin America do. And I would like to continue today, I would like to start today by continuing to talk about the history of Central America, and in particular, the history of Guatemala in the 19th and 20th centuries. Actually, my main topic for today is going to be gender roles and the history of indigenous or native women. One of the groups of women that I will talk about is the Maya, and the Maya make up over half the population of Guatemala. And I want to tie some of what I have to say about the history of Guatemala to the history of indigenous women. We will also hear in the second part of class today about a very important aspect of culture and cultural history in Latin America, and that is the history of religion, the history of the Catholic Church, of course, but also we will hear about the story of religious change in Latin America. So let me go ahead and get started by talking about Guatemala and the new nations of Central America, which is where I had finished last week. And one of the points I had made as I was finishing up was that after Central America became independent, and in a sense it became independent twice because it became independent from Spain as part of Mexico, and then it became independent from Mexico, but the liberal plans to unify the region failed because the area, while what became the countries of Central America do have certain similarities to each other, there also were and are enough differences so that unification was simply not a practical project in terms of nation building. So what happened in the early 19th century, in the late 1830s to be exact, was that liberal plans for unification had failed. And in Guatemala, which was and is the largest and economically most powerful country of the region in certain ways, I think by virtue of its larger population, in Guatemala, a strongman conservative dictator, in other words, a caudillo named Rafael Carrera, emerged. And Carrera dominated Guatemalan and Central American political life from the late 1830s until 1865 when he died. He had no formal education. He did, however, have great strength of character, some would say even to the point of being not only ruthless but extremely ruthless, and that allowed him to dominate Guatemala's political life until 1865, and that's the year that he died. He was typically conservative in ideology. We spent some time last week talking about the difference between conservative and liberal ideologies, so that I hope that is pretty clear at this point. He was typically conservative, as I said, and he restored the role of the church, and he developed political and social systems that were quite colonial in nature. He held the title of president. There was a legislature, but this was largely a sort of fiction, or perhaps it's better to say that it was largely a formality. He ruled as a dictator, and Carrera, was very dictatorial. The liberal effort to assimilate the indigenous population was abandoned, and colonial labor systems were maintained. The Indian, largely Maya population remained a separate and segregated group. And that had very major implications for the nature of society and politics in Guatemala, as you will see. The most important implication that it had was that while there was some racial and ethnic mixing as took place in other parts of Latin America, most especially in Mexico, which by the late 19th century thought of itself as a mestizo nation. That did not happen in Guatemala. Guatemala had a larger indigenous population than elsewhere in Latin America. Indians remained, as I said, separate and segregated, but it really wasn't just that they were separate and segregated. They were truly a secondary class, treated as laborers, treated as peons. They were extremely poor. In a poor country, many were the poorest of the poor. And in a lot of ways, this situation remains true to this day. Not that there haven't been certain kinds of political changes, and I will talk about that. Carrera imposed conservative leaders elsewhere in Central America, yet liberal ideology and supporters of liberalism did not completely disappear. And this led to one of the stranger events of 19th century Central American history, that is the intervention of one William Walker in mid-19th century Nicaragua. Both Central Americans and others had long dreamed of a canal that would connect the Caribbean Sea to the Pacific Ocean. And in the mid-19th century, the best possibility for such a canal, and of course you all know that this dream would eventually lead to the building of the Panama Canal. But in the mid-19th century, the best possibility seemed likely to be Nicaragua, in part because of its geographic location and in part because the U.S. had achieved a high level of, how shall I put this, influence. That's a good word. The U.S. had achieved a high level of influence over the Nicaraguan government. And American business owners had a lot of ties to wealthy Nicaraguans. Some of these wealthy Nicaraguans were liberals. They turned to the U.S. for help in trying to bring about the canal project, and some of that help came from William Walker, an intelligent, fast-talking Tennessean who, with Nicaraguan money, hired an army and invaded Nicaragua in 1855. Quickly victorious, however, his real interest became apparent because his real interest wasn't so much the canal as it was becoming an authoritarian Central American dictator. And he became head of Nicaragua's military and became the country's authoritarian ruler. Conservatives in other Central American states, as well as the British, who also had important business interests in the region, quickly declared their opposition, and they drove Walker from power in 1857, and in 1860 he was killed as he tried to return. This had many consequences for Nicaraguan history because liberals were discredited within Nicaragua because of this set of events. And Nicaragua's politics then remained conservative well into the 20th century. Elsewhere, however, in Central America by the 1870s, liberal politicians again dominated. And they supported, as I talked about last week, they supported ideas of economic development and progress. They wanted to try to integrate the region's economies, not only with each other, but more importantly, they wanted to integrate the region's economies into the global economic system as it was at that time. They wanted to appear civilized, they believed in education, and they tried to promote material improvement. Modernizing government and the military and stripping the church, the Catholic Church, of power were all policies of the late 19th century Central American liberal governments. The power of liberal governments led to two very important economic changes in Central America. And that is that two agricultural commodities, which already had been grown, but two agricultural commodities became extremely important. They became the dominant commodities in several countries, and they became so dominant that they had a major impact. One could even say a controlling impact on the economics and politics of Central America, and these commodities, of course, are coffee and bananas. By 1880, Costa Rica, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras were important exporters of coffee. Central America today remains an important exporter today. Starbucks, for example, features some Central American coffees. At this point, Central American coffees do not represent more than about 15% of the total world supply. But within Guatemala and Central America, coffee remains a major export, and Central American coffees are considered to be of very high quality. What did and does such specialization mean? We've talked about the consequences of economic specialization. Professor Kugler certainly addressed that issue. And she gave a number of examples, but she did so in a somewhat general way. Let me talk in relation to coffee and bananas about the consequences of specialization. They are pretty striking. In Guatemala and El Salvador, growing coffee on plantations meant land expropriations. What that means is there's a reordering of the relationship between peasant communities and large landowners and the state. That is, the national government. What happens is that coffee-growing plantations and plantation owners expropriated lands where they couldn't get land through buying. They found a number of different legal and what we might call extra-legal means to get the land that they needed for plantations to be the size that they need to make the economics of coffee production work. And in both places, land was taken from peasant communities that were Ladino, and I want to talk about the word Ladino in a minute. Land was taken from peasant communities that were Ladino and peasant communities that were indigenous. It is important to ask, what is a Ladino? Ladino is a concept that is used throughout Central America, particularly in Guatemala, to describe someone of mixed race who spoke or speaks Spanish and who identifies with Guatemalan national culture. The concept of Ladino is quite similar, of course, to the concept of mestizo in Mexico. But if you think about the words, and I do have to admit that I don't know the exact etymology of Ladino, but I think we can be pretty sure that it is from Spanish and its roots are Latin. And what it communicates is that in the process of racial and cultural mixing, what is emphasized in Central America and in Guatemala is the Spanish side of the equation, the Spanish side of the ethnic mixing. In Mexico, the word mestizo, also a Spanish word, the word mestizo, however, refers to the act of mixing. So the emphasis in the two words is somewhat different, and that usage of language is telling us something about the concept of racial and ethnic identity in the two different countries. And it is pretty interesting because they are right next to each other. There are some commonalities. There are many commonalities in terms of their history, in particular in terms of the history of conquest and the important role that Native groups played in the culture and history of each country. But the emphasis in terms of the kind of culture and the notions of identity that developed in each country are somewhat different. And I think it is fair to say that in Guatemala and in some of the other countries in Central America, but most particularly in Guatemala, the sense of racial and ethnic hierarchy is very, very strong. To be of Spanish descent is to be elite. To be Ladino is to be somewhere in the middle. To be indigenous is to be at the bottom. But the idea that I really want to emphasize, to get back to coffee, is that land was expropriated from both Ladino and Indian peasant villages. Coffee production was concentrated in the highlands. And in both El Salvador and Guatemala, while there were large populations, large peasant villages in the highlands, a lot of population was actually concentrated in the lowlands. So certainly coffee had a big impact on the economy of the highlands in both countries. But it didn't have quite as much of an impact, as dominant as it became, as bananas. One other aspect of coffee that is important and is interesting is that the ownership of coffee plantations tended to stay in Guatemalan and El Salvadoran hands. In other words, the owners of coffee plantations were not foreigners. They were Guatemalans and El Salvadorans. That didn't necessarily make them nicer or better, but it meant that the owners of these enterprises had a connection to the country where the coffee crop was being grown and harvested. Bananas were a different story. Bananas were first introduced into the Caribbean by New England merchants who formed the Boston Fruit Company. As the banana trade grew in conjunction with the growth of railroads in the 19th century along the Central American eastern coast, bananas began to be grown along that coast, again the east coast of Central America, which is lowland territory, and bananas were traded heavily to New Orleans, among other places. And in New Orleans, the Tropical Trading and Transport Company developed. In 1899, the Boston Fruit Company and the Tropical Trading and Transport Company merged. And they became a company that was very important in Central American and Latin American history, and is still very important in Central America and Latin American history, and that was, as it was known then, the United Fruit Company. Central Americans referred to the United Fruit Company as La Frutera. And I think that's a kind of interesting word, too, or term. It's an interesting term because it gives some idea of the power that United Fruit Company held politically, economically, and socially as well. The reason I can say that United Fruit Company still is important today, and you probably know it, is because while the name has changed, it still produces lots of fruit in Central America and other parts of Latin America, and it still plays an important political and economic role. Today, the United Fruit Company is known as Chiquita, and when you're buying Chiquita bananas, they probably were produced in Central or other parts of Latin America. And Chiquita has recently been in the news. If you follow news about Latin America, you might know that they've been in the news because they've been accused of interacting economically with paramilitary, very right-wing forces in Colombia. And if you know anything about the situation in Colombia, you know that it is very tense, very militarized, often on the brink of outright civil war over political issues that have not been solved during the entire second half of the 20th century. And it is interesting that Chiquita in its current form still is involved in politics and the economics of Latin America in some very important ways. The United Fruit Company in 19th and early 20th century Latin America owned railways, ships, docks, ports, and they created what are known as enclave economies par excellence. To quickly define what an enclave economy is, an enclave economy is a section or sector of a national economy completely devoted to a particular crop, often with ownership of the means of production of that crop by one particularly powerful company. And of course, the United Fruit Company and the growth of bananas fits the situation perfectly. Local Indigenous and Ladino workers grew bananas and performed other kinds of work for United Fruit Company. The company brought African-descended workers from Jamaica and Spanish-speaking parts of the Caribbean to Central America in order to reinforce and increase the size of the workforce. As they did that, they altered the ethnic and racial composition of the eastern Central American lowlands. So we're talking about major ownership of the means of production by United Fruit Company, because not only do they own railways, ships, and the other things that I mentioned in relation to shipping and movement of produce, United Fruit Company owned and or controlled millions of acres of land. Not only did they own millions of acres of land, some of that land they held in reserve. You can imagine that kind of ownership would create a fair amount of resentment, especially from people from whom land had been taken, because then they have to be in their communities struggling with the economic consequences of land loss and seeing the company hold land in reserve, which it holds in reserve in case of hurricanes or plant disease, and they're doing that so people like me can have bananas with my cereal in the morning. Throughout the 1930s, coffee and bananas accounted for about 75% of Central America's exports. In 1960, the figure was about 67%. Today, there is a lot more diversity in Central American economies. Tourism and textiles in particular play an important role. Nonetheless, coffee and bananas still account for a large number of exports, a large amount of export production. And the concentration, especially in the first half of the 20th century, on these two crops had a number of important consequences. for Central American economies. I think it's probably pretty easy to think of what some of the consequences might be. What might be some things that would be characteristics of the region as a result of the role of the United Fruit Company and one company, and let's just look at bananas, playing such an important role in terms of export production. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Yeah, Adrian.
If all the bananas caught some kind of fungus or something and all died out, then their economy would suffer?
Yeah, that's really good. That if anything happens to the crop from a fungus or anything else, a hurricane, there are going to be big problems for the economy, not just of one country, but several countries in the region, and really big problems. So overdependence on a single crop carries with it serious risk. Yeah.
That's kind of like the potato famine in Ireland. They were dependent on one crop.
Exactly. That's a good point. And we know what that can lead to, and one of the things it can lead to is immigration. Another consequence of over-reliance on a single crop, and a single crop that has to be produced in a very labor-intensive way, is that the company has to have a lot of control over labor. And this is not a kind of labor that is going to lead to social mobility. If you grow up growing and picking bananas, when you're an older person, you might very well be doing the same thing. So it doesn't lead to mobility on the micro level, that is, in terms of the individual person or family, and it doesn't really lead to the development of the economy. And when the economy doesn't develop, the consequence of that is that there is little to no industrialization. And in an increasingly industrial world, that increasingly leads to Central America and some of its largest countries, in and of themselves, being enclave economies. It's not just that there are sectors of the economy, but the whole economy, in a sense, is an enclave economy. While the countries of Central America began from the mid-20th century on to attempt to industrialize, agricultural production remained protected, and economies, even in the era of ISI or import substitution industrialization, even in the era where ISI was promoted, Central American economies remained focused on agriculture. Economies remained primarily agricultural, and populations remained largely rural, which meant that the patterns of urbanization that were occurring elsewhere in Latin America did not occur to the same degree in Central America. Annual per capita incomes remained very low. Levels of education, literacy, and health indicators all remained low. Such conditions exerted enormous political and social pressure on the region's governments. Because on the one hand, you have companies like the United Fruit Company who profit from this situation, so they pressure the governments to maintain this kind of agricultural production and specialization. On the other hand, you have rural people who are increasingly aware, self-conscious of the circumstances in which they live. They know that elsewhere in Latin America, let alone in the developed world, they know elsewhere in Latin America, in at least some parts of Latin America, change is occurring and more economic development is taking place, and they aren't participating in it. In Guatemala, which is what I want to focus on in terms of more recent political history, in response to this tension between an economic structure which companies, the U.S. government, and Guatemalan elites all have a stake in, yet the people of Guatemala have an ambivalence about. The consequence of the tension between these two forces meant that Guatemala has had a long history of caudillo rule and military rule. In the 19th century, whether liberal or conservative, strong men dominated. In 1944 into the early 1950s, for that brief amount of time, beginning with something called the October Revolution, this began to change. The October Revolution brought open elections in 1945. And in 1945, Juan José Arevalo Bermejo was elected president. He was an idealist. He believed in socialism, a very mild form of socialism. He wasn't a communist, but he believed in a mild form of socialism, that is redistribution of wealth. And he encouraged the writing of a more democratic constitution. He promoted worker organization. And he tried to build a stronger system of public education. So he believed in some forms of economic and social development. He was in office for 5 years, and in 5 years he experienced and had to endure some 25 military revolts from the Guatemalan military. In 1950, Colonel Jacobo Arbenz, the defense minister under Arevalo, was elected. Arbenz himself was a reformer. He didn't even call himself a socialist. He was, however, supported by the Guatemalan Communist Party, a fact which made Guatemalan elites, the United Fruit Company, and the U.S. government deeply, deeply suspicious of him. Arbenz embarked on policies of economic expansion. He was able to pass the first income tax in Guatemala's history. But the most important and most threatening part of his policies was his devotion to the idea of agrarian reform and land redistribution. The Guatemalan Congress in 1952 passed a law expropriating only uncultivated parts of large plantations. Remember, I said that United Fruit Company, for example, held land in reserve. So we're talking about uncultivated land held in reserve. The expropriations allowed 1,700 acres, for example, that were owned by Arbenz himself to be expropriated. But this was of little importance. That is, that he himself was giving up land. This was of little importance to the U.S. or the United Fruit Company. The Eisenhower administration undertook a campaign to destabilize Arbenz's government. And after creating a variety of pressures and operating through the OAS, or Organization of American States, the CIA bankrolled an exile invasion. This might sound familiar. The CIA bankrolled an exile invasion, and Arbenz stepped down just as planes associated with the exile group began to attack Guatemala City. Latin American nations were horrified. They protested this intervention. Yet the U.S. went forward, supporting the presidency of Carlos Castillo Armas, who ruled undemocratically, and in favor of coffee elites and the United Fruit Company. A series of strongmen then held the presidency, and beginning in the late 1950s, a whole line of right-wing military governments held power. This went on for about 30 years. In 1982, power was seized by General Efraín Ríos Montt, who was at that moment actually a retired army officer and born-again evangelical Christian. And that fact is both interesting and important because Ríos Montt's power allowed evangelical Christians to come into Guatemala in larger numbers and play a role in converting Guatemalans, some of them at least, from Catholicism to various forms of Protestantism. The growing revolt against military rule, however, which had already exploded into civil war in the mid-1970s, became more desperate in the period of time that Ríos Montt and his military successors ruled, and the circumstances of war changed dramatically. What happened? From approximately 1975 to 1985, the Guatemalan military, in league with paramilitary death squads, conducted a war against members of left-wing guerrilla fighting units, leftist political parties, union members, and most importantly, they took the war to the country's rural indigenous population. Military forces believed, as did their leaders, that Indians were natural, that they were a sort of natural left constituency, that they were leftists in sympathy with political leftists, communists and others. And what was important about Ríos Montt and the period that he governed and those that followed him was that he and those who served under him conducted a particularly vicious campaign against Maya communities, seeing them, as I said, as leftist sympathizers, as traitors. Whole villages were exterminated. Thousands and thousands of people died. Civil defense patrols consisting of men, often from indigenous communities, recruited from indigenous communities, were created in this period to control and fight against the villages and communities in their regions. Ultimately, at least 200,000 people died during the period of the Guatemalan Civil War. And it really was literally as if the country was torn in two and fought against itself. What is, I think, of significance about this, and there are a lot of things that are significant about it. Unfortunately, we can't talk about it in as much detail as the topic deserves. But among the things that are significant about the Guatemalan Civil War, I think, are that First, there certainly were significant political issues that underlie the struggle. And in a certain way, they go back to that liberal conservative struggle of the 19th century. They go back to the different visions of the country as more colonial and hierarchical or more modern and developed. And the fact that conservative dictators dominated for a long time and were able to control the politics meant that the population remained organized in a racially and ethnically hierarchical way that would lead, in a certain sense, to the other aspect that is so important in understanding this war, and that is that it was a war about race and ethnic identity. In 1996, a peace accord was finally negotiated. Fighting had largely stopped by the late 1980s. In the 1990s, Guatemalan political parties and social groups struggled towards a peace accord. It was finally signed. And then the country started to struggle with the aftermath. What was the aftermath? What was the meaning of this terrible set of events? And as you know from studying American history, a civil war is a terrible thing. We know it as we read the newspaper every day, and we see civil wars in several parts of the world, but we know it from our own history as well. It leaves lasting scars. And the attempt to understand the meaning of all the events that are part of a civil war that goes along with living through the aftermath, it is not something easy. And it certainly wasn't in Guatemala, and an example of how and why it wasn't is that Bishop Juan Jose Girardi, who oversaw the writing of a vast report known as the REMHI, Recovery of Historical Memory Report, which was a report that tried to deal factually with what happened. It has authoritative figures, who died, how many died, how they died. He was murdered under very strange circumstances just days after that report was released. In a lot of ways, Guatemala and the other governments of Central America have made real progress. Right now, all the governments are democratically elected. Most govern from the right, though the recent election of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua returns a leftist to power, but Ortega has said that it is his intention to rule from the center. Nonetheless, most people remain poor. Economic development plans like CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, remain untested as a means of developing Central American economies. Violence, drug trafficking, and money laundering remain significant problems. In Guatemala, violence and lawlessness remains a particular problem. Political violence remains a particular problem. At the same time as there is democracy, yet significant problems remain, Guatemala also still grapples with the nature of its identity and the identity of its people. And as I talk about gender, I'll come back to Guatemala and talk about some of the consequences of the Civil War, and one woman in particular, Rigoberta Menchú, who came out of the Civil War period as a social activist, who played a very important role both during and after the Civil War period, who won the 1992 Nobel Peace Prize. But before I talk about Menchú, I do want to turn to the issue of gender and the history of gender roles in Latin America. This is a huge topic. At the moment, I have about 30 minutes left. I won't be able to talk about every aspect of this, so I'll get through what I can get through and pick it up again when there is time for me to talk about these issues in the coming weeks before the end of the semester. But I do want to talk about gender and the importance of gender history. Just to say a couple of comments before I get into the whole issue of gender history and women's history in Latin America. Historians in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s began to turn towards what we refer to as social history, the study of different kinds of social groups that had not previously been studied very much by historians, and women's history was a major part of that. What's interesting about women's history, and I think one of the almost funny ironies of it, is that as women's historians turn to documenting the role of women throughout history in every part of the world, in every time period, we figured out that you really can't understand the role of women without understanding the history of men, because the definition of female roles and the definition of male roles, those two things are always in relationship to each other. So what that means is that historians began to focus more not just on women, but on men, on gender roles, on sexuality, sexual identity. And there are just so many interesting questions that relate to all those issues, and certainly historians of Latin America have been focused on looking at all these different aspects of gender history, which I can't possibly forget about in the rest of the time I have today. I couldn't possibly talk about them in the weeks that we have left in the semester. My particular focus in the study of gender, because that is one of the areas in my own work that I'm most interested in, my particular focus has had to do with women and recovering women's history. It is very hard to generalize because of the different ethnic, religious, and cultural differences across Latin America, and then of course we have the whole issue of the fact that there are different national histories that came into play beginning in the early 19th century. Nonetheless, there are a few generalizations to describe some of the history of women as a way of introducing the history of indigenous women, which is what I most want to focus on. There are some generalizations that I do want to remark upon in order to help us get to the issue of indigenous women and be able to look at that in a little bit more detail. Point number one, indigenous societies in the past, and here I'm talking really about the pre-Hispanic past, indigenous societies often were more egalitarian. Second point, colonization and Spanish colonialism either reinforced or brought new ideas of gender inequality, which were strongly reinforced by the colonial Catholic Church. In Spanish society, women were subordinated. In the Catholic Church, their role was and remains in certain ways secondary. So I do have to make one really quick point about Spanish gender roles in the colonial period, and that is that the Spanish inheritance system was quite different from that of the British. In the Spanish system, you have what's called bilateral inheritance, and in a bilateral inheritance system, women can inherit property and they can own it in their own names. And that is one way in which gender roles in Spain and ultimately in Latin America do differ from the British colonies and later early U.S. So I would say Spanish women were not quite as subordinated as the English women who came to the American colonies. Be that as it may, Spanish colonization did bring some new ideas about gender inequality. And as the new nation states of Latin America developed political systems and wrote legal codes, they wrote legal codes that expressed gender hierarchy. And that's the third point, that as nation states formed, the hierarchy that had become more rigid during the colonial period became even more so in the 19th and in much of the 20th centuries. As I pointed out, however, there were and are many different groups of women in Latin America, as there are throughout the world. There are elite women, there are middle class, poorer women, so there are class differences. There are and were Spanish women, women of African identity or descent, indigenous women, mixed race women. There were nuns and other religious women. Women could be married. They were often actually unmarried. Women were often thought of in stereotypical terms as either the good mother or the bad woman. That is, in Latin American culture, I think it was pretty common to see women in terms of their image as falling into one of these groups and defined by these two extreme ways of defining women's image and identity. Reality, of course, is more complex, and women's history certainly teaches overall that Latin American women have often been extremely productive and politically active. What I want to focus on in my comments about women, I want to focus on the history of indigenous women, and I want to talk about that thematically. That is, by asking what are some ways that we can understand indigenous women's history and experiences. I will look at this briefly in terms of the past, but I want to look at it in greater detail in terms of the more recent past and present, that is, the roles of women in the 20th and early 21st century, the roles of indigenous women in the 20th and early 21st centuries, and I want to look in particular at Mesoamerica and look at Nahua women and Maya women. But before I do that, there are some themes or ideas for looking at indigenous women that are important for us to think about. One of the most important points I could make about the history of Native women in Latin America is that this is a history that has been marked by both continuities and discontinuities. In other words, It's a history of lots of change, but also a history with some continuity. In terms of looking at both continuity and change, it's useful to look at women's roles in terms first of the long history of contributing productive and reproductive labor that they have, that is, contributing productive and reproductive labor to their families and communities, the often hidden role they've played in both political organization and activism for change, and the central roles they have played in family and kinship structures, especially in times of change and transformation where men, women, and children have to contend with rapidly shifting political and economic circumstances. And they often do so by making use of strategies that are not simply individual, but are familial and communal at the same time. In looking at the ancient past, as I alluded to before, there's no doubt that Indigenous women had and have subordinate roles in their societies, but archaeologists certainly can show that many native Latin American societies, especially in the period before the rise not just of urbanism but of empires, so in the period prior to about 300 BCE, before the Common Era, many native Latin American societies were relatively egalitarian in their social, religious, and even political structures. Yet a history that focused only on women's subordination would be very incomplete, because it would ignore the hidden roles of authority that women have played within and beyond their families and communities. So it is important to talk about women's agency. Agency is a really important concept that historians have used, social and cultural historians have used, to understand the history of all these different groups that have been subordinated in a variety of ways, yet still find a way to act upon the world. And acting upon the world, in a sense, is the best definition of agency. Acting upon the world to survive, that is, to reproduce the conditions that you need to live your everyday life. But of course, acting upon the world can be something far beyond surviving. Acting upon the world can mean becoming a revolutionary. So agency has at least two senses. There are at least two faces or two aspects of it that are important to think about and that are useful in thinking about women's history. First, agency can refer to everyday actions that produce and reproduce life and living. When I talk about reproducing life and living, I'm not just talking about reproduction in the sense of having babies. I'm talking about reproduction in the sense of the things that we do every day to make sure that when we wake up tomorrow, our kids, our significant others, maybe our parents, other relatives, that we all have what we need to keep going. So I mean reproduction and production in this sort of general sense. And that takes some agency. You have to be able to act upon the world. You can't be sitting in isolation in prison and really reproducing life. Somebody else is probably doing it for you under those circumstances. You're not doing it for yourself. So there's an everyday aspect of agency, but there's also a sense of agency as taking power. Agency as acting to influence others, to influence other people, to influence events, to create events, to defend one's culture and society, to change one's culture and society. Agency in this more active sense. There are a lot of different aspects of it. As I talk about the history of Indigenous women, without denying the forms of subjugation that they often experienced, and I will mention some of that, I want to emphasize their history as a history of women's agency. Their history of labor, their history of familial activity, that is, activity within their family realms, that's useful and important in a variety of ways, and I'll talk about some of that. And I also want to talk about them as political actors, that is, that women took political action in the past and in the present. It is important, as I've already noted, however, to acknowledge that both anthropologists and historians continue to find evidence of gender asymmetry, with women usually in the lower status in relation to men, not just in Latin American indigenous societies, but in many of the world's societies, past and present. But we can't assume that gender asymmetry or hierarchy is universal. And social scientists and scientists have never been able to find a single cause or reason that explains the presence of asymmetry. There's no biological explanation that explains it fully. There's no economic explanation. There's no ideological or psychological explanation. I think gender asymmetry comes about and takes many different forms for a lot of different reasons. Nonetheless, asymmetry does exist, and it is something that we need to talk about when we look at Indigenous women's roles. But as I've said, these ideas of work, family and kinship, and politics are important in understanding Indigenous women's experiences. They have a long history of performing not just reproductive but productive labor. This was true in the earlier past, the more distant past, pre-Hispanic period, colonial period, true in the 19th and 20th century, and it's true today as well. What's interesting about looking at women today is that Indigenous women, as I would argue women everywhere in the globe, are increasingly experiencing the impact of globalization. Worldwide, more women than ever before perform paid labor. Much of the growth in women's employment, especially factory employment, has in fact occurred in Latin America. It's occurred in two parts of the world, in particular in Latin America and Asia. And before I talk more about economic change as a context in which we need to, as a context that we need to look at in order to understand the experiences of Indigenous women generally, I do want to come back to the concept of globalization, because globalization is very important. We have talked about structural reform, we have talked about neoliberalism, but we haven't really talked a whole lot about the concept of globalization. Structural reform and neoliberalism are related in fundamental ways to globalization. Globalization can be understood more narrowly as actually as a very simple set of changes which can be summarized by talking about the increasing economic integration of the world's economies. Again, globalization can be understood as the increasing economic integration of the world's economies. That's a pretty simple idea, and I hope all of you know what I'm talking about, because I think we're living it every day. There's hardly anything we use that is produced 100% in the U.S. And we know that we are producing things that are going elsewhere in the globe, especially we're producing culture that's having a really big, popular culture, that's having a really big impact on the rest of the world. Britney Spears doesn't just make news in the U.S. She's followed in Latin America, in Europe, in many different parts of the world where you wouldn't think teenagers really would be worrying about Britney Spears. But that gets at the other part of globalization that I think is important. And when we look at globalization in terms of any group, particular group, when we look at globalization, globalization is also a cultural phenomenon. So it has these two sides. It's about economic integration, it's about cultural integration, but it's also about resistance to those kinds of transformations. So getting back to the broader context of globalization and women's labor. As I said, more women worldwide than ever before are performing paid labor. A lot of that is factory employment, not all of it, but a lot of it is, and much of it has occurred in Latin America and Asia. Yet waged employment is only part of the story of economic change for women, especially Indigenous women. Even if women do not perform wage labor, they may take on traditionally male tasks because of male out-migration. And we all know also that migration is a very major topic in the contemporary world, not just in our own country and in our own political system, but in many countries and in many parts of the world. And just as the immigration of large number of people coming here has a big impact on us, out-migration and outflows of people have a huge impact, a tremendous impact also, on the countries and people who stay behind. And one of the consequences of lots of men leaving, though it's also the case that the gender makeup of flows of migrants has also changed, but I won't be able to talk about that right now. Large numbers of men leaving to perform migrant labor in other regions or other countries has a lot of consequences on the people, especially women left behind. What happens? They take on traditionally male tasks. They intensify aspects of traditional female productive roles. They may start to do in larger numbers and spend more hours of the day in craft production to earn cash, to pay for goods that male heads of household formerly did. And women themselves may end up migrating, because sometimes there are circumstances in communities where so many men have migrated, sometimes women's circumstances become untenable. So women themselves may migrate. Some of the women cleaning houses and caring for children in Houston are Indigenous. They might be Maya, they might be Nahuas, they might be Quechua speakers from Ecuador, Peru, or Bolivia. But the women who come from other countries and clean houses and care for children are part of what the sociologist Arlie Hochschild has referred to as the global care chain. And some of these women in Houston and other communities throughout the United States do come from Indigenous backgrounds and communities. The increased workload borne by Latin American and other women has had a very heavy impact on their lives. When I say that the increased workload of women has had a heavy impact on their lives, it is important to realize, and I do want to point out, I am not comparing women's labor to men's labor in that statement. In other words, I'm not saying that women are working harder than men. I'm not necessarily saying that. What I'm saying is that women's labor has intensified over time. They work harder than they did in the past. In addition to the greater time spent working, whatever small increases in autonomy for wage-earning women that occur tend to be outweighed by the subordination that women often experience in workplaces that use gender hierarchy to keep women's wages low and to control their potential workplace activism. In addition, male attitudes in homes and communities increasingly define and denigrate work like craft production as housework rather than productive labor. So, as we know, the world's a complicated place, and two different things can go on. Women can work more, they can earn more money, but it might not necessarily lead to an improvement of their status. And what does change gender status in terms of women and men and their relationships with each other that's a complicated question. These kinds of changes are frequently accompanied by increasing destabilization of family life. As women begin to work more, domestic violence, alcoholism, and single-parent households, usually headed by women, become more common. This is the context of globalization and change in women's work patterns that Indigenous women have dealt with in Latin American history. Another context, another important theme, does have to do with women's political roles and activism. We can chronicle a history of women playing important political roles in Indigenous societies from the pre-Hispanic period to the present. That is not a continuous history. In other words, women's political roles have changed. Of course, it sounds beyond obvious to point out that as political systems have changed, women's and men's roles in those political systems have changed as well. What's important about talking about women's political roles is that's often what I would call a hidden history. And it's hidden in a number of ways. Women's political activism is often not chronicled very much as part of the historical record, so it's hard to find out about it. And it takes some work and digging to do that. But it's hidden in another way. Historians who have tried to study this question have found that, for example, when using the technique of oral history, just talking to people about their recent history and what people have done, women's activism is often forgotten, downplayed, or denigrated. Sometimes by men, sometimes by women. Because that activism, which I would argue is often a part of women's roles in history, it's a sort of often a normal part of their roles, not always, but often, is at the same time in conflict with a more hierarchical, maybe even patriarchal definition of gender roles that says that men are in the dominant legal and political position. I think the idea of women not playing important political roles really became institutionalized in Latin America for indigenous women certainly, but other women as well, in the 19th century as constitutions were written, as legal codes were developed that reinforced gender hierarchy. But in the 20th century, especially the late 20th and early 21st centuries, real change has taken place. Globalization has hurt women economically in a lot of ways, I would argue, but paradoxically, and I think Rigoberta Menchú, as I'll talk about when I have a chance to, I think Rigoberta Menchú is actually a good example of the way that paradoxically globalization has actually enhanced in certain ways women's political activism, power, and their ability to voice agendas of change. Voice and image are two other themes that I think are important in understanding women's roles in the past and indigenous women's roles in particular. One of the things that indigenous women in the contemporary period have begun to do is to create their own historical record. Maya women in particular have been very active in doing that. And when I'm able to talk specifically about the history, the more recent history of Nahua women, women who are part of groups that are the descendants of the Aztecs, who we talked about earlier in the semester. When I can talk in more detail about Nahua women and Maya women, I'll use these themes of work, family, politics, activism, voice, image as a way to talk about the activities and history of women. And we need to
All right, and good afternoon. I'm Professor Andrew Chestnut. I am Professor of Latin American History here at the University of Houston. I've been here for 10 years, and I specialize in Brazilian history and also the religious history of Latin America, about which I'll be talking today. I did my doctoral dissertation at UCLA 10 years ago and have published 2 books. The first book came out 10 years ago, entitled Born Again in Brazil, and it looks at the proliferation of evangelical Protestantism, specifically Pentecostalism in Latin America. And my more recent publication, which I brought with me, is entitled Competitive Spirits, Latin America's New Religious Economy, and it looks at the most dynamic religious groups in the region today, which I will be talking about today, and that would be Pentecostalism, a type of Protestantism, the charismatic Catholic renewal, and African diasporan religions. This came out in 2003. And following up on this, I am currently engaged on a 3rd book project on Mexico's Virgin of Guadalupe. Today I'm going to give an overview of the religious landscape of Latin America, which may surprise you. In the past half century or so, the religious landscape of Latin America has become much more pluralistic and heterogeneous. First of all, though, let's throw out some questions. Why even examine, albeit briefly, the subject of religion in Latin America? Anyone want to take that on? Any thoughts about why this is even worth spending 75 minutes on? Go ahead. Sure.
I guess it's because it would be part of the cultural history and in some instances political history of different parts of South America or Latin America.
Exactly. A integral part of Latin American culture and politics. Good. Anybody else want to chime in? Why this is worth looking at for the next 70 minutes?
I'll say that I think one could argue, though I'm curious what you think about this, I think one could argue that the Catholic Church was responsible for some of the commonalities in terms of cultural and religious and cultural belief in Latin America. Some of the themes in Latin American life and culture that tie the region together, even though it's so diverse and disparate in many different ways.
No doubt. I would definitely concur that this is one of the great cultural commonalities. And if sometimes we're dragging in Brazilians kicking and screaming to include them in the rest of Latin America, we can again point to the common Catholic identity, I think. So yeah, I would concur with that. Anybody else like to offer your thoughts on why ponder this question of religion in Latin America? Okay, I have my own thoughts. First and foremost, whether or not Latin Americans practice their faith in an institutional context, Latin Americans tend to be deeply religious. Surveys of religiosity in Latin America typically show that about 95% of Latin Americans believe in God or a higher power. Prayers to the various national, regional, and local incarnations of the Virgin Mary, and of course the most salient of them would be the Virgin of Guadalupe, or for Pentecostals, communication with the Holy Spirit, are an everyday occurrence for tens of millions of Latin Americans. Again, regardless of whether or not these people are attending Mass on a regular basis on Sunday, are going to Protestant worship services. Beyond the pale of the institutional setting, religion is deeply embedded in the cultural fabric of the region. In addition, as you mentioned, one cannot consider the political history of Iberoamerica without taking into account the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church came with the Iberian conquerors and colonizers, the Spanish and the Portuguese, as part and parcel of their overall project of colonization. And until we get to roughly the mid-19th century, there really is no separation as we know it here in the United States, between church and state. Essentially, church and state were wedded in both Brazil and Spanish America. And so many times, clergy in the Catholic Church wore two hats, also serving as royal officials. This is very common, particularly in the colonial period. So the Catholic Church has been a major political player up until present day. With the great growth in Protestantism over the past 5 decades or so, we also seen over the past 20-25 years, Protestants in Latin America have also thrown their hat into the political arena and have made real differences in many national and local elections. For example, I can think of the 1989 Brazilian presidential contest won by Fernando Collor de Mello, surprisingly, despite his lack of a national party to back him. And many observers of the Brazilian political landscape attribute this to the overwhelming Protestant vote that Collor received in 1989. Ditto for the Japanese-Peruvian presidential candidate, Alberto Fujimori. The 7 to 8% Protestant population in Peru was solidly behind Fujimori. And closer to home, since the early 1980s, in our largest and most populous Central American nation of Guatemala, we've had a series of Protestant presidents, I think exclusively Pentecostal. And I keep throwing out this term Pentecostal, and briefly I will define it for you. So, the political arena also is one of great import as well. We cannot look at Latin American political history without looking primarily at the Catholic Church and more recently at Protestant participation. I think there's also some other compelling reasons that as students of Latin America, it's imperative that we look at religion. In many ways, the present and the future of global Christianity is dependent on what plays out in the Latin American context. Now, this might sound like hyperbole to you, but I'll give you some reasons, I think, to back up this statement. First of all, Latin America is by far the most Catholic region on earth. Some 40% of the world's Catholics are Latin American. 40% of the total Catholic population of the globe is Latin America. So anybody interested in the present and the future of global Catholicism has to almost necessarily start with Latin America. I keep wondering when the Vatican is going to wise up and choose a Brazilian or a Mexican pope. Hasn't happened yet. In addition to the 40% of all Catholic figures, it also happens that our two most populous Catholic nations on earth are also Latin American nations. Can anybody guess the country on earth that has the largest Catholic population? Good guess. Mexico's number 2. Mexico's number 2.
Maybe Argentina?
That's a good guess. What?
Brazil?
Brazil, exactly. Brazil, by far, is our largest Catholic nation. Mexico comes in at number 2. And over in Western Europe, Italy, a lowly number 3. So, any students of the Catholic Church have to look at Latin America. In addition, I said global, I didn't say global Catholicism, I said global Christianity. And why is this? Well, it turns out that a Latin American country now has the second largest Protestant population in the entire world. I'll say that again. A particular Latin American country has the second largest Protestant population in the world, larger than any Protestant population, for example, of Western Europe, and second only to whom? What country has the largest Protestant population? United States, right. And now number 2 is Brazil. So not only are we focusing on Latin America, but we keep returning to the importance specifically of Brazil. Brazil's second largest Protestant population on earth. And if we're going to get even more specific and look at the type of Protestantism that really is flourishing in Latin America, also in Africa and Asia, Pentecostalism, Brazil has the largest Pentecostal population on earth today. There are more Pentecostals in Brazil than there are in the country of its birthplace, here, the United States. Brazil number 1 in Pentecostal population, and United States number 2. So I would say that anybody interested in what will be the developments in both global Catholicism and Protestantism as well cannot ignore Latin America. Indeed, probably should start with the region that we call Latin America. Are there any questions or comments before I move on? And I'd like to define a few key terms before I proceed. Questions, comments, clarifications? Yeah, sure.
Are you going to go over how or the shift from Catholicism to Protestantism occurred?
Yeah. What I'm going to do after I define a few key terms is briefly describe the 3 major religious traditions in the region, which are Catholicism, Protestantism, and the so-called African diasporan religions. So most of today's class will be spent on these 3 major religious traditions of Latin America. But I think before we move on, a few definitions are in order. And most challenging, perhaps, would be religion. What is religion? You might be surprised or not to find out that even among serious scholars of religion, there isn't always much agreement about how to define religion. So I think for the purposes of today's lecture, we're probably safest to keep a definition as comprehensive or as broad as we can. So if you want to take note of this, I would offer that a good working definition of religion would be a system of beliefs and practices relating to superhuman beings. A system of beliefs and practices relating to superhuman beings. So you can see that's pretty vague, pretty comprehensive, and so within it we can fit both of our so-called monotheistic religions. Anybody familiar with that term, monotheism? One God. 3 great monotheistic religions. Anybody name 1 or 2 or 3? Christianity, Islam. Right. In the historical order, of course, there'd be Judaism, Christianity, and more recent, Islam. Exactly. So, these are monotheistic in that they all posit one overarching supreme being, one overarching God. But this definition is broad enough so that we can also include the so-called polytheistic religious traditions. Poly, of course, meaning many, many gods. And the one of particular import to us are the religions of the African diaspora. African diaspora. Does anybody familiar with that term, diaspora? No? A diaspora is a great dispersal of people from their homeland, and historically one usually thinks of the Jewish diaspora, but of Jews leaving their homeland and spreading throughout Europe and other parts of Asia. But in terms of sheer numbers, a far larger diaspora was the African diaspora, in which millions of Africans, primarily from West Africa, South Central Africa, are wrenched from their homelands and forcibly brought over to our New World, the Americas, as slaves. So when I talk about African diaspora, I'm talking about all of those people who were brought over originally as slaves from Canada northward down to the southern cone in South America. And the religions that they brought over as part of their cultural baggage survive. Not only survive today, but in many cases are thriving, are flourishing. So these African diasporan religions, unlike our Christian traditions, are, in terms of their practice, squarely polytheistic. I think when we're considering religion in Latin America, indeed religion in any context, it's important to keep in mind that the relationship between religion and society is a dialectical relationship. Good Marxist term, even though I do not subscribe to a Marxist view of religion. Anybody familiar with this term, a dialectical relationship? What I mean is that religion and society mutually influence each other. You cannot look at religion in a cultural or societal vacuum. You can never divorce it from its cultural context. Likewise, we can point to many instances in Latin America and here closer to home where religion also has a great influence on society. So I'm saying that there's mutual influence, there's mutual interplay that go back and forth between society at large and religion. We never can divorce religion from its societal context. In my own studies, and given the nature of the historical nature of demographics in Latin American population, I tend to focus on what we know in the field as popular religion, or sometimes also known as folk religion. Now, what do I mean by popular. I'm taking it from its Spanish or Portuguese origin, popular, not meaning that it's more widespread or people are more enthralled with it, but that it popular meaning that it comes from the people at the grassroots, people at the base. And so what we'll see here is that we can parse out, we can identify some common elements of popular religion. Whether or not a Brazilian is a Catholic, a Protestant, or let's say a member of the African Brazilian religion of Umbanda, there are some common elements that unite the type of religious practice across these institutional differences. So what I'm saying here is that social class can have a very great influence on how religion is practiced. Not only at the base, at the grassroots of any given society, but also at the upper echelons. Indeed, if we were looking at U.S. religious history, I could do a socioeconomic ranking for you right now of the various Protestant churches, the various Protestant denominations, in terms of the education and the income of their membership. And for example, the very highest, the most elite Protestant church, which claims more U.S. presidents, any guesses? The Episcopalian Church. The Episcopalian Church. And then at the lower end of the spectrum, a church that was born among the disenfranchised of our nation would be the Pentecostal churches. Anyway, so going back to this notion of popular religion, what are some of the characteristics of popular religion that set it apart from the religion of the middle groups or the elite? First, we can see that popular religion is characterized by contexts in which there is a very personal and intimate relationship between human believers and the supernatural. I'll say that again. A personal and intimate relationship between human believers and the supernatural is very characteristic of popular religion. So, I'll give you an example. When you hear people, for example, describing their relationship with Jesus as if Jesus were their best friend, this would be an example. This is a very hands-on type of religion. Another important characteristic of popular religion is this is religion that requires limited mediation by religious specialists. That is, yes, the priests and the pastors and the mothers and the fathers of saints are there, but they are not as central to the practice of this religion as they are in the religion of the better heeled classes. Because a lot of the practice of popular religion takes place beyond the sanctuary, beyond the walls of the church, where there's often no priest or pastor present. So, limited priestly mediation is also another characteristic. And I would also argue, somewhat contrary to the Marxist view of religion as alienation, that often in the Latin American religious context, and probably more today, now that there's more religious pluralism and more religious choice, that popular religion often serves as a force for overcoming a hostile secular environment. It offers supernatural power to those who have been rendered impotent by their respective societies, and many times feel that the only way that they can cope with the grinding poverty that they're submitted to is through supernatural succor, through supernatural aid, through the help of Jesus, or the Virgin of Guadalupe, or the Holy Spirit, in the case of Pentecostals. So, in general, I think we can often see that popular religion offers the experience of spiritual power to those who are on the short end of the stick in terms of material power and political power. So you can see it almost as a type of compensation. So there's a real strong sense of empowerment, I think, that enables millions of Latin Americans, and this ties into what Professor Kellogg was talking about prior to this lecture, particularly for women. And I probably failed to say that at the outset. The organized practice of religion in Latin America, although in many cases it is dominated by men, in any given institutional setting, Catholicism, Protestant churches, Pentecostal churches, a good 70 to 75% of the active membership will be female. And indeed, many cases, the day-to-day life of churches from Mexico down to Argentina really are sustained by the energy and efforts of Latin American women. Okay, moving on to another important definition or concept, I think, that should be understood, is that in Latin American religion there is a great deal of syncretism. Anyone out there in TV land familiar with this concept of syncretism? Religious syncretism? Syncretism is when we have the coalescence or the fusion of different or discrete religious beliefs and systems and practices into a new religious conglomerate. Again, the fusion of discrete religious beliefs and practices into a new religious conglomerate. And if you think about it, almost every major religious tradition in the world, to some extent, has syncretized. Indeed, many of you probably grew up in a Christian context. Can anybody think of certain Christian rituals which have no basis in the Bible, but were integrated as part of pagan rituals? In fact, I can think of one that's approaching this weekend. Easter. And what about Easter? Excuse me? yeah. You have to buzz in on that. No. The eggs, the Easter bunny, even the Christmas tree. In fact, there's some more sectarian Protestant groups who will not have Christmas trees in their homes because they are very cognizant that there's no really biblical basis to having Christmas trees, and this is picked up as the church spread through places like Germany. Anyway, all of our established religions are full of interesting instances of syncretism, but it turns out that the Latin American religious landscape, I believe, is particularly rich in syncretism because we have the arrival of a folk medieval Catholicism brought over by the Spanish and the Portuguese, which was heavy on the magical and the mystical elements. And then over time, it syncretizes or fuses, and depending on the region that we're talking about, Latin America, if we're looking at Mexico or Peru or Bolivia, Guatemala, where you have larger indigenous populations, over time, this folk medieval Iberian Catholicism syncretizes with the local indigenous beliefs, the pre-Columbian beliefs. In the case of those parts of Latin America where we had heavy importation of African slaves, then more important would be the fusion between West African religions and Catholicism. Can somebody mention one of the two main areas where the great bulk of African slaves ended up in Latin America?
Brazil and the Caribbean.
Exactly. Brazil and the Caribbean. Exactly. And so what we have happening, for example, is points of contact existing between Catholicism on one hand and indigenous and or African diasporan religion on the other. And one of the great points of contact where we see syncretism most obviously taking place is between the Catholic saints and, in the African diasporan case, the orixás, or the spirits, as they're called in both Brazilian candomblé and Cuban santeria. There was often a logic which governed the way in which syncretism would take place. For example, we have the case in which the orixá called Ogum, who is associated with iron and turns out to be the patron orixá of blacksmiths, syncretized with the Catholic saint, Saint George the Dragon Slayer. Can anybody help me out and see what the point of contact would be between the patron saint of England, Saint George the Dragon Slayer, and Ogum, associated with iron? I should have brought in a portrait of Saint George.
Could it be related to the sword or the metal?
Exactly. The sword, the steel, the iron of the sword. Exactly. And so there's usually a point of contact in which governs the logic of syncretism. Another example, which is usually posited, but we probably need more historical research on this particular point, because we don't know if it really did occur. But many scholars of religion and historians aver that syncretism took place between our greatest virgin of Latin America, the Virgin of Guadalupe, and a goddess who was already worshipped at the site, at the hill where the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared to the Nahua-speaking Juan Diego, purportedly in the year 1531. You probably might not know that before the apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe in what is now Mexico City in 1531, there actually already was a Virgin of Guadalupe existing where? What would make sense? What country would there already been a prior Virgin of Guadalupe? Spain. There already was a Spanish Virgin of Guadalupe. Anyway, it is thought that the Mexican Virgin of Guadalupe syncretized and took on features and became indigenous looking in appearing at Tepeyac, the hillside which is today squarely within the confines of Mexico City, and syncretizing with the Mexica goddess called Tonantzin. Do we know what Tonantzin means in Nahua? Any Nahua speakers out there? Tonantzin happens to mean our mother. So there is a interesting correspondence. Anyway, more historical research is needed to see if this indeed really happened. But I could go on and on with different Catholic saints and show you how they have syncretized. And this is particularly manifest in the case of African diasporan religions. And probably the greatest example that we have of syncretism in Latin America, or the most proximate, would be the creation of a whole new religion in Brazil in the 1920s. In the 1920s, in our Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro, is born a new, highly syncretic religion called Umbanda. Umbanda is a very kaleidoscopic mix between what was the local African diasporan religion practice in Rio de Janeiro, which was called Macumba, and which today is often used as a derisive term in Brazil to dismiss Afro-Brazilian religion. It's basically like calling it witchcraft. You call somebody a macumbeira and you're calling them basically a witch. Anyway, before Umbanda's emergence in Rio de Janeiro of the 1920s, we have a religion, African diasporan religion, called Macumba, practiced in Rio de Janeiro. In addition, we throw into the mix folk or popular Catholicism. And in the second half of the 19th century, very elite Brazilians would go to Paris to do their university studies. And not a few of them came back with a new religious tradition that they had acquired spending their 4 to 6 years in Paris, and that would be French Spiritism. Anybody familiar with Spiritism? At the same time, it was very popular in the United States the latter half of the 19th century into the first decades of the 20th century. I saw something in the news about an effort to exhume Houdini. Anybody know how our greatest magician started his career? It was trying to debunk spiritists who he believed were responsible for tricking his mother and leading to his mother's premature death. Some of you, when you were kids, or maybe you still do it, played with Ouija boards. That's part of Spiritism. The table wrappings. But most important element of Spiritism is communication with spirits through human mediums. And so this was very popular in the United States and France in the late 19th century. So many elite Brazilians who went to study in France at that time came back and brought Spiritism to Brazil. And today, Brazil is probably the country in the world, the only country in the world where this type of Spiritism still has a fairly strong following among the upper middle classes and elite. Anyway, throw this Spiritist tradition into the mix with folk Catholicism and Macumba, and we have the creation of an entirely new Brazilian religion based, very importantly, on spirit possession called Umbanda. And so here is our foremost example of syncretism at play in Latin America. I find this religion fascinating. In a way, it's kind of a sacralization of Brazilian history. You find different Brazilian characters showing up in the spirit world, in the cosmos of this religion, Umbanda. Even today, in some of the newer, more recent Pentecostal churches, you will see elements of syncretism. If you talk with the pastors of the church, they would hotly deny that there's any type of syncretism taking place. But indeed, in the more recent so-called neo-Pentecostal churches, those that have emerged since the late 1970s in Brazil, we definitely see them incorporating practices of Afro-Brazilian religion as well. So, historically, syncretism has been an important part of, particularly of popular religion in Latin America. In addition, what has characterized most of the Latin American population has been dual or multiple religious affiliations. What do I mean by that? Well, even today, many of those who maybe practice Umbanda more than practice Catholicism will tell the census takers when they come around that they're Catholics. And they might really practice both and see no contradiction between perhaps going to Sunday morning Mass and then Friday or Thursday night going to services at their local Umbanda center. This, particularly in the world of popular religion, going to different types of faiths, which particularly in the Christian world would be seen often as very contradictory of Christian doctrine, has been pretty much standard practice until our great growth of Protestantism. Protestant churches are very adamant about their membership being loyal to their congregation and particularly not dabbling in African diasporan religions, which they almost uniformly regard as satanic, essentially. So Protestantism, the growth of Protestantism, has broken with this tradition of dual or multiple religious affiliation. But of course we know that there's probably still many Latin American Pentecostals and Protestants who probably still go to other traditions despite risking censure from their pastor. Okay, with the time remaining, let's move on and quickly survey these three major religious traditions I've been referring to. And of course, it would be appropriate to start with the one that is the oldest and today is still the largest and most important in Latin America, and that would be Catholicism. You may or may not know that Catholicism is one of the three major branches of Christianity. Can anybody name one of the other two? Excuse me? Protestantism, exactly. And the other one really isn't almost worth mentioning, at least for the purposes of Latin America, but since we're mentioning it, since we're talking about the three major ones, anybody come up?
Orthodox?
Exactly, the Orthodox tradition, which resulted from a schism or a split between in the Catholic Church. Anybody give an example of a Orthodox church? Denomination? Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, exactly. But for our purposes of Latin America, Orthodox Christianity is only a very, very small practice. What we're mostly looking at is Catholicism and Protestantism. Catholicism is the oldest major branch of Christianity. Last time I checked, it is still headed by the pontiff who resides, in this case, where is our latest pontiff? Benedict. Where is he from? Germany. Yeah, he's German. Pope John Paul II was Polish. Lately we've seen this Western, going out of Italy, Western Europe. I guess the Catholic Church still hasn't figured out, again, like I said, that the future is here in Latin America, also in Africa as well. Until really roughly the 1950s, Latin America was uniformly, monolithically Catholic. To be Mexican, to be Argentine, to be Paraguayan, just as to be Spanish or Portuguese was to be Catholic. So much so that as late as the 1940s, only 1% of Latin America was Protestant as late as the 1940s. Why was this? Well, of course, the Iberians, the Spanish and the Portuguese, brought over what was their official state religion. They imposed it, and during the 3-century-plus colonial period, it was the the Catholic Church had a monopoly on the official production of religion. And then when we get into the independence era of, for most nations, the 1820s, one nation after another decided to continue to grant the Catholic Church a monopoly, making it the official state religion of the Mexican nation, of the Argentine, Guatemalan, etc. So, from roughly 1500 till we get to the 1850s, or 3 centuries and a half, the Catholic Church enjoys a monopoly on religious production in Latin America. It's not until we get to the mid-19th century with Mexico on the vanguard where we enter in a period from the 1850s through the 1920s in which one Latin American nation after another disestablishes or divorces the Catholic Church from the state and at least constitutionally, legally declares religious freedom after basically, again, 3 centuries and a half of religious monopoly. Who do you think this opens the door up for, most importantly? Don't think that African diasporan religion, that voodoo and candomblé is able to take advantage of this right away. But who are the prime beneficiaries here of this relative declaration of religious liberty? Protestants, exactly. So this set the legal or the constitutional framework for the robust religious pluralism that we see today in Latin America, the changes to the constitutions that went on during this period. But it really took the Pentecostals to come in at the beginning of the 20th century to exploit that legal framework which is set up and to convert millions of Latin American Catholics to their churches. Again, Brazil is our largest Catholic nation on earth. But when I say this is also somewhat misleading, because for most Latin Americans historically, Catholicism has essentially been a type of civil religion, a cultural institution that has provided social cohesion and occasional religious commodity, but not necessarily a strong institutional commitment. We know this by, despite the fact that this is the most Catholic region on earth, even today, not more than 10 to 15% of those who identify themselves as Catholics participate in the Church's weekly activities on a regular basis. So the great majority of Mexicans and Brazilians and Guatemalans who tell the census takers that they're Catholic really have no meaningful connection, meaningful participation in the institutional Catholic Church. Now, I would argue that there's reasons for this, and the main reason is the monopoly. Monopoly, in any sense, tends to create apathy. When you don't have a choice, service tends to be poor, provided by monopolists. I would argue that that's the reason. If we look at Catholic Church attendance in the United States and in Canada, where the Catholic Church never had a monopoly, historically it's been triple. Close to 40% of Catholics having, not necessarily weekly, but regular participation in the church, despite the fact that only, 25% of Americans today are Catholic. Historically, the most important type of Catholicism has been popular or folk Catholicism. Or the Catholicism practiced by the masses. There are some particular characteristics of popular folk Catholicism. Perhaps most importantly, and again, this is a Catholicism that has its roots in Spanish and Portuguese folk Catholicism. Probably most importantly is that popular Catholicism is first and foremost big word for a pretty simple concept, hagiocentric. Anybody familiar with that term?
It focuses on the saint.
Exactly. Hagio means saint, saint-centered. This is a religion which puts the saints, the myriad Catholic saints, and the virgins at its center, relegating what other figures to lesser roles. Yeah. God the Father and Jesus, while they're there, have not been the primary objects upon which Latin American popular Catholics have developed their relationships. Their relationships have tended to center on these saints and virgins. Why is that?
You have to turn off your microphone on the switch. So, yeah, this will sound better. Keep searching below you. It's going to be the microphone somewhere. There. The wire. The wire.
Here.
So we cut it off.
Our class starring Don.
Guess I need to wear a button shirt next time, huh? Any thoughts about why this would be the case? Why the saints and the virgins would be favored over God and Jesus? Yeah.
I guess because they would take different roles. They have different jobs. You could pray to a different saint for a different, I guess, for whatever you need. Like if you have a saint that you can ask for a job, or you have a saint that you can ask to get pregnant, I guess, and so it has many more functions to have relationships with saints and a virgin than to Jesus, I guess, and God.
Yeah, that's good. That's true. There's a specialization that takes spiritual specialization that takes place among saints, no doubt. And also, perhaps on a broader level, they're probably more accessible, aren't they? In many cases, they actually were real historical figures, right? So perhaps they're easier to approach than the more remote God the Father and Jesus as well. I don't know if anybody has spent any time in Latin America, wandered into the Catholic churches and seen the typical depictions of Jesus. But you usually get two main depictions of Jesus. You get the crucified Jesus, if you didn't grow up Catholic, rather gory, crucified Jesus, or you get the non-threatening baby Jesus. But you rarely get the Christ the Liberator of liberation theology Jesus. Anyway, hagiocentrism is one of the hallmarks of popular Catholicism. Also, this is a type of religion that is heavy on pilgrimages, religious pilgrimages to sacred sites, and I think about which is the most important in terms of numbers of faithful visiting each year would be the Basilica Tepeyac, home to the Virgin of Guadalupe, visited by millions of Mexicans, Latin Americans, and North Americans each year. And if you make it down to Mexico City, just an hour and a half plane ride south of here, that is a obligatory stop on your itinerary right there. In addition, this is a religion that heavily emphasizes healing. And so one of the star players here in the world of popular Catholicism are the, I'm going to write this in the feminine because most of them are women, are the curanderas, coming from curar or to cure. The curanderas, in fact, there's hundreds of them in Houston as well, with our very large Mexican and Central American population. And they are folk healers who use a very syncretic form of healing. In the case of Mexican Central America, they're syncretizing folk Catholic elements with indigenous elements. But this emphasis on healing, miraculous healing, is supreme in the world of folk Catholicism. Indeed, what many of those millions who visit Virgin of Guadalupe each year are asking for or giving thanks for is some type of healing, be it of physical affliction or some type of psychological trauma. And until very recently, popular Catholicism really has been the predominant religion in Latin America. But as Pentecostalism has grown by leaps and bounds, and as the Latin American population has made the very rapid transition from a largely rural-based one to a heavily urbanized one, to some extent this world of popular religion, which tended to be more agrarian or rural-based, doesn't hold the same sway that it has historically. Okay, let's move on to quickly survey our next major religious tradition in Latin America, and that would be Protestantism. Protestantism arrives in Latin America relatively late on the scene. The first time we start to get a permanent presence of Protestants is around the time of independence of most of the region, 1820s and 30s, when we have immigrants coming to places such as southern Brazil and Argentina and bringing their Protestantism with them. Most importantly would be German Lutherans settling in places like southern Brazil, but we also have at the same time, small communities of British Anglicans, mostly merchants in places like Buenos Aires, Argentina as well. So these are immigrant Protestant churches, mostly allowed to hold services in their native tongue, German in the case of the German and the Swiss immigrants, English in the case of the British Anglicans. And these churches are not interested at all in proselytizing or evangelizing Latin American Catholics. They're content just to hold services for their own small immigrant communities. Fast forward a few decades later, by the time we get to the 1850s, 1860s, mid-19th century, we have our next wave of Protestants come in, and these are missionaries. And they are coming into Latin America with the intention of converting people who they see as a lesser evolved form of Christianity to their more evolved type of Christianity. And so 1860s, 1870s, second half of the 19th century, we get mainline missionaries from mainline churches. What do I mean by mainline? Some of the historic Protestant churches, such as Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists. These are the main denominations, mostly coming from Southerners from the United States, departing places such as Texas and Georgia, seeking converts to their churches in Latin America. They are, yeah.
What caused the shift, causing them to go from being content with having their small groups to wanting to convert?
Oh, these are entirely different traditions. The first ones I'm talking about are European immigrants, and they're not interested in evangelizing. And these groups are American Southerners who are interested. So very different mentality about evangelizing. But they are spectacularly unsuccessful. The Baptists do fairly well, but the Methodists and the Presbyterians, I told you, almost a century later, when we get to the mid-20th century, 1940s or so, still not more than 1% of the Latin American population has become Protestant. So let's fast forward to the group that has been spectacularly successful, and that is the sub-branch of Protestantism that I keep referring to, and that is the focus of my first book, Born Again in Brazil, Pentecostalism. If I can write it here. I know some of you are refugees from my Religions in Latin American class. Anybody remember how Pentecostals are different from other Protestants? What distinguishes them? Mm-hmm. Yeah, they tend to be literalists, or if we want to use that difficult term, fundamentalists. But yeah, they do tend to be literal in their interpretation of Scripture. That's true. But that doesn't distinguish them, for example, from Southern Baptists, who also are literalists as well.
It's their emphasis on the Holy Spirit.
Exactly. Their emphasis on the Holy Spirit. They're on the gifts of the Holy Spirit. They have a practice and belief called the second baptism, or baptism in the Holy Spirit, which is something that's very different from baptism in water. They take this from the book of Acts in the Bible, in which it talks about the apostles being baptized and speaking in tongues and fire. Most other Protestants regard this as a practice that historical practice, but that's not meant for contemporary Christians. And so this really is what distinguishes Pentecostals from other Protestants, this belief and practice of baptism in the Holy Spirit and the so-called gifts of the Holy Spirit. Can anybody name an important gift of the Holy Spirit, which often happens when Pentecostals are taken by the Holy Spirit? Speaking tongues, right. The technical term for speaking tongues is glossolalia, coming from the Greek for tongue. So yeah, this is really, yes, they are literalists, they are fundamentalists, but what really distinguishes them is their emphasis on the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. Has anybody been to or seen Pentecostal worship services? Have you actually been to?
When I was very young, it was scary.
Why scary?
It's just, for a kid, I mean, I was, I don't know, maybe 12 or something, and it was just seeing all these people sort of in speaking tongues, and some of them throwing themselves on the floor. It was a scary experience for me.
Yeah, there is a level of spirit, animation, fervor often in these churches that I grew up. I'm the son of a retired Presbyterian minister, and there was very little bodily participation in my father's church. We would stand up maybe to sing a hymn and then sit down, and that was it. But in these Pentecostal churches, the body, the soma, is very much part of the worship service, in which there's jumping and there's slaying in the spirit, and so it's a very corporeal religion in which the body is part of the worship service as well. And this, for whatever reason, has found very fertile cultural ground in Latin America. So much so that today, and I'm going to give a talk in another context about this soon, what we have seen, this type of Pentecostalism has been so successful that today in Latin America we can basically say that Christianity is Pentecostalized. And to back that up, I'll tell you that of all Protestants in Latin America, if my pen will work, 75 to 80% of all Latin American Protestants are Pentecostal. This figure goes even higher for certain countries like Guatemala, where it's probably 85 to 90%. So Protestantism itself is essentially a Pentecostal affair. We can basically forget about the Presbyterians and the Methodists. And in fact, the Methodists and the Presbyterians, and even the Baptists to some extent, to keep up with the Pentecostals, have Pentecostalized themselves and now offer Pentecostal-type worship services. In fact, if you see for example, a Presbyterian church in Latin America calling itself renovada or renewed, that means that it is Pentecostalized. Moving over to the world of Catholicism, today, I forgot to tell you, the most dynamic form of Catholicism today is a movement called the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. Charismatic Renewal, and surprise, surprise, what it essentially is a Catholic form of Pentecostalism. In fact, in the first years, this is another movement that was born here in the United States, 1967 in Pittsburgh. In their first years, 6 or 7 years, they actually called themselves Catholic Pentecostals. You can imagine that didn't sit too well with the church hierarchy, so they quickly changed their name. So this is also the most dynamic form of Catholicism. So what we really are talking about today is a Pentecostalized form of Christianity in Latin America. As time expires, why has Pentecostalism been so widely successful among Latin Americans, particularly those of popular class origins? Diverse regions, but in a nutshell, I would put primacy of place on the role of faith healing in Pentecostalism. In my own research, my dissertation research, I saw that time and time again, particularly women or men too, had come to this religion looking for some type of healing, some type of cure of afflictions intimately related to their situation of poverty, which they were unable to resolve in secular contexts. and they come to this church, which is very heavy on the faith healing. Accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. You'll be healed of alcoholism, of AIDS, of your abusive husband, whatever it is. But unlike the institutional Catholic Church, which has not put healing at the center of its praxis, Pentecostalism was born with a mission of faith healing. And so I would argue that this is the real engine that has been propelling Pentecostal growth over the last 5 or 6 decades. So that's the most important thing to understand about the world of Protestantism, that today it is a Pentecostal affair. The 2 countries which have the largest Protestant populations, Puerto Rico, but of course that's a U.S. Commonwealth, Guatemala. The thinking is that maybe within the next 10 to 15 years, Guatemala might actually have a Protestant majority. I guarantee you it already does in terms of practice. On any given Sunday, definitely more Guatemalans worshiping in Protestant churches than there are Guatemalan Catholics. But actually, those who say that they are actually self-identify, good chance in 10 to 15 years Guatemala is going to be our first Protestant country, and this is particularly the case among the 50 to 55% of the country who are Mayan Indians. Have a few more minutes to, unfortunately, giving short shrift to the African diasporan religions. Again, these are polytheistic, spirit-based religions that came over as part of the cultural practice of African slaves. Probably most importantly for at least 2 of our 4 African diasporan religions, for Cuban Santeria and Brazilian Candomblé, is the religious practice of the African ethnicity, the Yoruba, of whom we have tens of thousands right here in Houston, because most of them are from modern-day Nigeria. It was the religious practice of Yorubans come over as slaves to Cuba and Brazil. Their religion over time syncretizes with Catholicism, and in the beginning mostly as a way to camouflage continuing practice, because this was, again, religion that was not seen as religion, it was basically seen as witchcraft, and often had to be practiced under the cover of darkness. And this is also part of the compelling logic of the syncretism that takes place between the Catholic saints and the Orishas of the African diasporan tradition, to camouflage or to hide the ongoing devotion to the Orishas from the Catholic plantation masters in Brazil, Cuba, and in the case of Haiti, of course, we have the religion of voodoo. So, in their practice, they center on spirit possession. The Orishas come down and they possess believers, and the most visible and manifest way in which they possess believers is through dance. The different Orishas, the different spirits, have their own rhythms and dances, and this is how they most often will descend and manifest themselves. And a commonality or a phenomenological bridge that we see with Pentecostalism, and indeed with charismatic Catholicism, is the primacy of spirit-based religion. And in my recent book, Competitive Spirits, I argue that it is the religions that are based on intimate, direct contact with the Spirit. Of course, in the case of Pentecostalism, Catholicism, we're talking about one overarching Holy Spirit. Here we're talking about multiple spirits with a lowercase s. But this is the commonality. As different as Umbanda, Candomblé, Haitian Voodoo, Cuban Santeria is from Pentecostalism and Charismatic Catholicism, there is that strong commonality. There seems to be a great demand among the Latin American popular classes for spirit-based religion, hands-on religion in which the supernatural is intimately and physically felt. Again, in great contrast to the type of Protestantism that I was brought up by my my Presbyterian father. So these are the three major religious traditions, and with the pioneering role of Pentecostalism arriving in 1910, 1911 to Latin America, and quickly starting to win converts, Pentecostalism starts to exploit the legal framework that already had been established in most nations and to gain adherents, to gain converts. And so, thanks to Pentecostalism's pioneering role, today we have a religious landscape in Latin America that is not too far from that of our own United States in its diversity and its pluralism. Today, as a Brazilian, you can choose from these religious traditions. You can be a Jehovah's Witness, a Mormon. You can go into the Amazon and try to resurrect Amazonian Indian practices. The religious options available to particularly urban Latin Americans are almost as diversified as they are in what is the most diversified and pluralistic religious landscape on earth here in the United States. So, besides the Pentecostalization of Christianity, the other great trend historically has been going from religious monopoly of Catholicism to robust pluralism, in which Latin Americans no longer necessarily inherit a religious tradition, and even if they do, many of them choose to change their religious tradition, often several times during a lifetime. And so we see the type of religious pluralism that historically has existed here in the United States.